All right. Once again, a bit late, but hopefully not too late that we're in any serious way out of sync. Today, I want to get a fair bit done. Let's see how well I do. You'll forgive me. I have some notes here I'll be looking at from time to time. I also have some coffee here I'll be drinking from time to time. Both, I fear, very much needed for this to go decently, let alone well. Today, I want to do two broad kinds of things, two different kinds of projects. Hopefully, it's all right to jump from one to another. First, of course, more on this idea of publicity, what it means, how to understand its relevance to our discussion of utilitarianism. And I also think there are two kinds of further questions to take up once the power of Rawls's point is grasped and acknowledged. There are still some residual issues that I'll mention. One of them, I think, is well within our range and purview. The other raises, I think, a very deep issue that I don't expect you to master. I myself don't exactly know what I think on it either, but it should be mentioned. That's just how to do philosophy. If a subject leads us somewhere, we should pursue it. Secondly, I'll say some opening remarks about Hume's argument on property, which is, and I know I'm not the only one who feels this way, an absolute masterpiece of social theory. The accounts of our circumstances and human nature and how property arises in 3-4 pages. There's just more in those 3-4 pages than in books, on my view, by equally famous philosophers on how to think about persons and how property arises. We leave behind the projectivist of the earlier sections of the treatise, and here have, what I would call a kind of rule utilitarian and a constructivist. Property for Hume is clearly a construction that arises in order to perform a terrifically fertile form of utility. And as such, certain kinds of typical rule utilitarian problems arise for Hume. To his credit, he faces them. He has an extremely good answer. We'll get to all that later. All right. So that's the general topic of today. More on publicity and then Hume. Okay. What is this crazy idea of publicity? Well, Rawls doesn't use the word all that often in this essay. I'm kind of reading the argument in Two Concepts of Rules through the later development of this idea in Rawls's own later theory. But you should think of it as a requirement Rawls feels, I think rightly, is appropriate for how we understand any social proposal, any institution, any practice, that the right form of that practice is one in which it is understood to be in compliance with the publicity requirement. And in a way, I guess it can be easier to see what publicity amounts to. You might call it transparency or absence of deception, if you think about what it is when it isn't there. And the only places typically where it isn't there are examples in moral philosophy textbooks and in science fiction stories. Here is one of these places where science fiction is very fertile ground for a philosophical point. And in something like Aldous Huxley's classic Brave New World, and in many science fiction movies, we have arrangements which are not in compliance with the publicity requirement, where by that I only mean the understandings that the people who live under an arrangement have about that arrangement and the truth regarding that arrangement are not the same. People are interacting with one another interacting with the institutional authorities, with certain beliefs in their head about what things are, how things are arranged, but in fact, they're substantially different. And the alleged efficiency or success is tied to that deception. Huxley makes this very clear in his caste society in Brave New World. One of the levels of the caste, I think it's the second from the lowest, is deceived, hypnotized into believing that in fact they're valued deeply by society at large. They perform these menial, dangerous, unpleasant tasks with a certain amount of good cheer because they are hypnotized, as it were, at birth into believing that, in fact, they're very, very much treasured and valued in doing so. So things indeed do go very well, and lots of people do this dangerous low-wage work, but they do it with false beliefs in their head. Without those false beliefs, the society would be nowhere near so stable. And you can tell all kinds of stories. And as I say, science fiction is very good at telling those stories where, and then at the end of the movie, we, have this big reveal. Oh my God, it turns out that you guys were just taking care of persons in order to eat them. I guess that's the classic one, And what seemed like a very agreeable, congenial arrangement was agreeable and congenial only because people were deceived about the actual nature of the arrangement. I think Rawls is absolutely right to say, tell your story, sell your screenplay, shine that flashlight under your chin at the campfire, whatever. When we're doing political theory, not interested in considering as a serious or credible or plausible candidate for our assessment any arrangement when it's understood not to be in compliance with publicity. Why? Well, because we're considering various social theories or social policies with the idea of them actually guiding our social cooperation and social coordination, much the same way in which if we're considering different contracts, we're considering contracts where it's assumed both parties will know the content of those contracts. We're not interested in considering a so-called contract in which one party is deceived about its content, and that's how we get all this great compliance. What's the point of that? We're interested in figuring out what the best contract is, where it's understood that best means best when in compliance with publicity, when people aren't deceived about its content. I hope this is getting a little clear. And I think this is a point Rawls makes it in defense of utilitarianism, to sort of cut to the chase, use an expression I've never very much liked. Rawls thinks that most of the right's criticisms of utilitarianism work only if they're understood in ways that don't meet the publicity requirement. So they're not, in the end, all that interesting or all that powerful, or criticisms we need to take very seriously. I think he's quite right, as a matter of fact, about what the actual criticisms in the literature have been. As you'll see, I don't think that there are no good worries or criticisms of utilitarianism that survive, which is to say, I think that there are some scenarios that can be characterized in ways that meet the publicity requirement. I think we as a country recently lived through one, and that raised problems for utility. But unsurprisingly, they're not the bang, bang, you're dead problems of the rights criticisms. And indeed, I think Rawls is quite right, that bang, bang, you're dead quality. Well, aren't you committed to cutting up a body? Aren't you committing to punishing an innocent man? I think those examples really do deflate like a balloon with the air going out once you reconfigure those examples in ways that meet the publicity requirement. I think this is a very deep criticism or counter. And as I suggested along the way, I think it's a very good point to keep in mind if you're interested in political theory, whatever you take up. If you're going to consider any political arrangement or any social policy initiative, consider it in a way that is in compliance with the publicity requirement. And that's the version of it that, as theorists, we need to take seriously, not some version in which the parties regulated or guided by the understandings in play are deceived about what those understandings are. That's not something political theory has to worry about. That's just to introduce an element of deception and manipulation. That's not telling you about the theory. It's just manipulation. And that's another matter entirely. Sure, it happens all the time. It's not something we should be easygoing about, but it's not a serious problem with a theory when you imagine the theory being employed deceptively and then say, you see what a bad theory this is? No, you haven't shown anything about how bad a theory it is if you imagine it being implemented in ways that are manipulative and deceptive. No, not interested. Okay. That's the basic point behind publicity. All right, what's the application here? Well, Rawls says, look, and it's a kind of several step move, and it relies on that distinction between a move within a practice and the practice itself. But to kind of put these points all together, the point is something like this. Don't tell me about simply a doctor cutting up a patient and distributing the organs. Don't tell me about some state punishing an innocent man for all kinds of beneficial results. Tell me what the practice would be of which this would be an instance. Describe the institution. Describe the practice of which this would be a move in the practice. So, are we to imagine, to go to the punishment case, and Rawls does a very good job, there's a minister of discretionary punishment. And this is known, much the same way there's a minister of war. And this is known. There's a cabinet position. There's somebody who will have the job of picking out people who we have no reason to think of as guilty and putting them forward as guilty with the idea of promoting utility. This is what it is to meet the publicity requirement. The action is described as an instance of a practice, and it's understood that the practice is transparent. Its true nature is known to those that it regulates. So we have, a statute which says all doctors may, on their discretionary authority, when they have good reason to believe, and so forth and so on, anesthetize their patients and harvest their organs. If doing so has a more than reasonable chance of promoting the greater utility. This would be a known rule. And so when you walk in and the doctor does it, that would be an instance of a practice that is known publicly to be in place. Now you ask, is this going to promote more utility? Now you ask this so-called rights criticism. And Rawls's point is, well, when it's understood as a practice publicly known, there's no utility at all. There's no utility in the state saying, we're going to take somebody we know to be not guilty, put him forward as if he were guilty. How's any benefit going to come out of that? And if the rule was that patients coming into the doctor's office to get their blood pressure checked could not leave because their organs were found to be suitable for a variety of those who need them, I don't think there'd be much utility in a society which had that practice either. People wouldn't go to the doctor. They wouldn't trust the doctor. They wouldn't, pursue. They'd see these doctors as, and rightly so, their enemies. So Rawls's point is, when we imagine these so-called rights criticisms as institutions publicly known, the utility pretty much disappears. And they kind of evaporate out as serious challenges to a utilitarian orientation. Okay, a utilitarian justification story. And I think this is one of these few places in the course where it's not just, well, what he said and here are the strengths and weaknesses. I think there's certain points in Rawls's argument that constitute a real advance in political theory. I think Rawls is pointing out the reasonableness of insisting on our discussions always being of policies that are understood to be in compliance with the publicity requirement is a real advance. And for me, as soon as somebody starts spinning some example which doesn't meet the publicity requirement, I just raise my hand and say, just stop. I don't have to answer this. This is nonsense. If you tell me some story about deception and manipulation, this isn't political theory anymore. Go write a screenplay. So this is a great advance. It should be kept in mind when talking about libertarianism, Marxism, pure, market capitalism, whatever. Always imagine the policies you have in mind that you're defending or criticizing to be in form that, or to be formed in ways or instantiated in ways that are in compliance with the publicity requirement, because that's what social policies are. They're conceptions of social coordination and cooperation known by the parties to be the conceptions that they are. And it's in that form that we assess them. Okay, that's that point. Great advance, great counter to the rights criticism, sure. However, issues. First, unsurprisingly, certain complex worries for utilitarianism still arise even when in compliance with the publicity requirement. This is increasingly becoming ancient history, but after 9/11, the Bush-Cheney administration, instituted a variety of policies like extreme rendition and enhanced interrogation. They, sometimes detained people at airports without any, prior judicial approval, took them to black sites and subjected them to horrible enhanced interrogation. But it was known they were doing this. I mean, this wasn't a secret. They didn't tell you who they were going to do it to, but that the Bush-Cheney administration was engaging in these violations of past procedure and the ordinary constraints on governmental abuse. It was publicly known. They didn't hide the fact that this was going on. And they would have given a classic utilitarian defense. Yes, we're doing this, but given the horrible things that would occur if we were to let this slip through our fingers again. I mean, you can tell the story. You know how this would go. That's a case where the abuse or violation is conducted in ways that do meet the publicity requirement. I can't say Bush deceived us about what his administration was doing. He got a lot of people to describe it euphemistically, but we're very far from these standard rule utilitarianism criticisms where people really don't know what's going on. You're walking into that doctor's office with absolutely no idea this is something a doctor can do. The innocent man who's plucked out by the state and put forward as guilty has no sense of this. And of course, leaving him aside, he quickly figures it out. But the population at large must be deceived about what the state is doing. That's not the case in the examples I have in mind. I once had a student who'd had some military experience give me an analogous example from his military experience, where sometimes the sergeant will engage in arbitrary punishment, and that it's arbitrary is absolutely part of the point. I'm going to just pick you to do this extra work. I'm not saying you did. In fact, I want everybody to know it's random and arbitrary. It's meeting the publicity requirement. It's not obviously justified. And if it is justified, inevitably there's some kind of utilitarian justification story. But these are examples where the debates about how good the utilitarian justification would be do occur against the background of the policy meeting the publicity requirement. All right, that's one point. I do think the Bush-Cheney example is an interesting one, since they did give utilitarian justifications for these up until then unacceptable expressions of governmental power. So it's a good example to keep in mind. I do just want to repeat, I think Rawls's argument is an effective, just swatting the fly reply to the typical rights criticisms of utilitarianism. All right, here's a more complicated worry, and I myself am not sure exactly what to think. I'll bring it up again when we finish with Singer, because I think it is an interesting contrast with the Singer aggressively reformist argument. As you know, I'm assuming you've already read the Singer. It's certainly one of the more attractive and easy and provocative pieces you'll read in this course. Singer takes a very aggressive attitude towards our habits. I'm not going to say any more. And you might say, when thinking about like the involuntary organ donor case, or the Rawls discussion of punishing an innocent man case, you might say, yeah, Rawls, you're right. Of course, there would be no utility for a society in which it was understood that the doctor could cut up your body if he thought that there was utility in doing so. And there would be no utility in the state putting forward someone that they did not for a moment claim was genuinely guilty if everybody knew that's what was going on. Absolutely, you're right. But how much of that is the result of persons having certain very deep non-utilitarian intuitions about what they deserve? I mean, to what extent does the utilitarianism of, how can I put it, does the absence of utility in having this arrangement stem from the fact that people believe, well, I have a right to my body, and I, cannot allow the doctors to take my organs just because there's greater utility. And in the punishment case, well, I have a right not to be punished by the state unless the state makes a good faith effort to show I really am guilty of what they accuse me of. I mean, what I'm getting at is, to what extent does the truth of Rawls's point that these arrangements would not, if they were publicly known, produce utility? Yeah, right. It's true. I think there's no question. If you're looking at these two arrangements, doctors can do it, doctors can't do it. It's very clear the arrangement in which doctors can't do it is going to be the more stable, the one in which people will have better health care, the one in which everything goes more smoothly. But is this true because of some deep non-utilitarian value that we just have these very strong, we'll find out later, broadly Kantian intuitions of what we deserve, what we're entitled to, what it is to respect our autonomy and dignity? Are all these other non-utilitarian notions in the background, in virtue of which these utilitarian outcomes are as Rawls describes them? I'll give another example. This may make it clearer. It may not. It's like the eye doctor, clearer, sharper. We'll see. Consider something like the various decisions we have to make about intellectual property and how much protection or ownership you get. So if you write a song or if you publish a novel, you own that thing, and other people can't reproduce it without paying you a royalty or without getting your permission for a certain number of years. Now, different jurisdictions can do this differently. I don't know what it typically is in America anymore, how many years it must pass before that song becomes public property, called in the public domain. And then you don't have to worry about compensating whoever wrote it. And that's why you have the Hume. I can just reproduce the Hume for you. I don't know, the Hume is over 200 years old, so it's in the public domain. Other things, if they're by somebody still alive, we need that person's permission if we're going to reproduce it, etc. You might say, well, typically these laws are justified by reference to utility. By protecting the author's property, we encourage people to write and go through the sacrifice and effort of producing these things. We have to give them these incentives of ownership in order for the arrangement to be, in fact, productive. There's a very nice utilitarian justification for giving people ownership rights to, say, the novels they write. Say, well, if you didn't, people wouldn't write the novels, and that would be, disutilitarian for us all if songwriters and novelists and others didn't make the effort to contribute to the public world in this way. And so by giving them ownership, we enhance utility. Sure. But does that expectation of entitlement, seeing that novel as mine, reflect a pre-utilitarian, a non-utilitarian idea of ownership? It's mine because I made it, because it's an expression of my labor, because it's an expression of my mind. There's a kind of notion of ownership here that we can make sense of without the benefits of recognizing that notion of ownership. So the deep question, which you won't be responsible for in any exam, but I think it is in the background of the Rawlsian point, is to what extent does the absence of utility when these practices are known publicly stem from what you might call a pre-utilitarian notion of entitlement or desert? Do we think, yeah, I'm just entitled to have the state not do this to me? I'm entitled to have, a certain understanding with my doctor in force. I'm entitled to own the novel I write. And these notions, once acknowledged, will promote utility, sure. But it's no surprise that respecting the moral understandings we think right will promote utility. What I'm asking is, are the moral understandings themselves utilitarian in nature? It's not obvious they are. And I think I could point it out, but I think this is going a little further than we want. There are passages in Mill's Utilitarianism where he seems on both sides of this issue himself, in the chapter on justice and utility. I think it's very easy to point out that an arrangement that respects pre-existing moral understandings will have utility for those who hold those understandings. It's no surprise. You're going to, enforce people's expectations. But the question I'm asking is whether those understandings show you that there's something else besides worry about, say, pleasure and pain going on in our moral life. I mean, maybe what these understandings show is certain alternative moral understandings about, say, desert and entitlement and autonomy and respect. We'll get to all those when we get to Kant. So in a way, bringing this up now is premature because we don't really have an alternative moral vocabulary with anything like the power of utilitarianism before us. But if you think about the doctor case and the punishment case, I think you can see what I'm talking about. Maybe you can even see it in the intellectual property case. Sometimes the utilitarian argument seems to presume non-utilitarian moral understandings. Maybe. It's a very interesting question for me. And the reason I brought up Singer is Singer takes our pre-utilitarian argument habits and treats them with the appropriate disrespect they deserve. And you might wonder, why isn't that happening, say, with the doctor case? Why is here our pre-utilitarian argument habits winning the day? Why is it that our rejection of the utilitarian use of my body as an instrument for the production of utility for others, that just seems absolutely right? Well, my hunch is because there are these sort of pre-utilitarian intuitions about entitlement and desert and respect that are going on in that argument. And sure, when they're allowed into the story, the best thing to do from the standpoint of utility is to acknowledge them and not violate them. But it's not obvious that the content of these understandings are best thought of as or in terms of benefit and utility. No, maybe not. Maybe there are these other pre-utilitarian notions of desert and entitlement that are really driving the argument in this this case. I think that might be true. And this isn't supposed to be a criticism of utilitarianism exactly, as a kind of note about the limits of utilitarian theory. If there are non-utilitarian pre-moral theory intuitions, or if there are certain conceptions of the self and entitlement and desert that we make sense of without drawing on a utilitarian vocabulary, that in turn must be acknowledged when thinking about what is the best thing from a utilitarian point of view. This just shows you the way in which no single theory has the whole truth about moral life. And I'm sure that's a congenial point. All right. I hope this made some sense. I'd love it if there were further questions about this. So I'll just recap and then we'll move on to you. First, the publicity point is a point about rephrasing the typical rights criticism such that it's not an action that we speak of, but the practice of which that action is an instance. Don't tell me about a doctor cutting up a patient. Tell me about an understanding in society where doctors are empowered in such and such ways, and this is known. Don't tell me about punishing an innocent man. Tell me about a state institution which has the directive or the mission of finding such persons under the appropriate circumstances, doing the publicity campaign to convince the outside world that this person really did it, et cetera, et cetera. And this is known. Well, when we re-describe the criticisms in ways that have them as institutions or practices publicly known, they fail, in fact, to be instances of that which would promote the greatest utility. That's true. However, keep in mind 2 points. One, sometimes questionable practices are put forward and justified in utilitarian terms, and those practices are in compliance with the publicity requirement. I do believe that was the case with the Bush administration's, I won't say violations, but abrogations or moving past what had previously been traditional understandings of appropriate government respect of privacy and the like. They said they were going to do it, and they did it, and they even got Congress to pass certain laws allowing them to do it, and so forth and so on. So publicity takes care of what you might call the phony problems, but it doesn't take care of the real ones. And the Bush-Cheney case is a very good real one. Unsurprisingly, that's a case where you can make the argument on the other side. You know, when you have a case that's in compliance with the publicity requirement, unsurprisingly, the argument really can be made on both sides. I'm not going to take that argument up now. I hope that's clear enough. Secondly, is this last and somewhat elusive point that is an extremely rich one when thinking about moral philosophy generally. To what extent is the utilitarian entitled to annex or make use of what you might call non-utilitarian ideas of respect, desert, autonomy, and the like? I think that's what's really going on in these punishing an innocent man and cutting up the patient examples, that we're drawing on pre-utilitarian notions of entitlement and respect. And of course, if those notions have a kind of, undeniable or foundational status for us, obviously an arrangement which violated those would fail to have utility for us. And an arrangement that respects or preserves those will have more utility for us. But the utility here, as I say, piggybacks on a non-utilitarian moral notion. And that suggests to me that the truth of moral life is pluralistic, that however much plausibility there is in thinking about, benefits for a population, what counts as benefit will sometimes mean preserving what will turn out to be a Kantian idea of respect or autonomy or desert. I'm going to leave it at that. Pause, turn the page. Now to Hume. All right. Well, as my earlier remarks suggest, I think Hume is just a genius on this subject. And I'll just rehearse some of the very general points and then, of course, hopefully underline the relevance of Hume's argument for utilitarianism. Hume is concerned to tell a story that is, by his own admission, somewhat discontinuous with the story he was telling earlier in his projectivist account. Hume believes that while a great deal of our moral life is rooted in our biology, and so is natural in the way that seeing color or tasting what we taste when we taste salt or sugar is natural, he also believes there is a place, a very deep place, for construction, for artifice. And actually, I think, although we don't generally think of Hume as a constructivist, here in this story of property, he's the most brilliant constructivist we've ever had in the English language. Okay, how does it go? Well, we start by identifying the background conditions against which society, which for Hume is very closely tied to property, in which society and then, if you like, then property arise. What are these background conditions? Well, on one hand, there psychological facts about persons, and on the other, there are certain objective facts about nature. The facts about persons are that we are of limited generosity. We are not completely selfish. Hume is, I think, extremely shrewd and extremely sharp in his criticism of Hobbes. I mean, some of you may have taken other political theory and you know something about Hobbes's idea of the state of nature, in which persons being in a state of conflict and war with one another must be deeply adversarially related to each other and so forth. Hume points out, I think this is just undeniable, that this is quite absurd, and that what makes it otherwise, to use his own language, is the natural attraction between the sexes, that people will be attracted to each other, they will have children together, they will raise those children, and all kinds of things arise through this story. We will be interested in the welfare of our partner, we'll be interested in the welfare of our children. This is a natural story. The idea that the state of nature is a bunch of solitary men with spears fighting each other. You know, one has to ask, and it's almost a feminist point. So how did these men get there? How did these men get there? Were they, cloned in some laboratory and sent by spaceship? No, people are born of, women, men and women, and they're raised in conditions of helplessness. And, without families nurturing them, they don't, have a very good chance of making it to this later stage in which they can be these threatening cavemen. And society, in this sense, Hume argues, I think very credibly, has its origins in this proto-society of the family, and families arise, in apes and persons, if you will, naturally. This isn't something that requires a social contract. This is something that arises through natural attraction and certain proclivities that we've clearly been selected for. However, while we are not intrinsically and only and thoroughly selfish, because we will make sacrifices for our children, and we will worry about the welfare of our partners and so forth. We are not thoroughly selfish. Still, we are what Hume calls of limited generosity. We are not going to be as motivated by the interest of strangers as we are motivated by the interest of our children. I mean, this is just this deep fact. We're not thoroughly selfish, but we're not altruistic saints either. We're not these, the angels in heaven. And Hume's point is, if we were saint-like, I mean, he's going to make this point down the road in the argument, we wouldn't need property. If we were naturally disposed just to give to everyone equally, if we were as motivated by the welfare of everybody on the planet as we are by the welfare of our own children, then the idea of having to set up certain institutions to preserve our wealth and so on would probably never even arise. If we were a community of saints, property would almost certainly never arise. So you have that psychological fact in the background. We are not thoroughly selfish, neither are we altruistic saints. We are creatures of limited generosity. I myself can find nothing objectionable or wrong with that description. It's a very plausible, astute account. And what's remarkable is, as far as I know, you don't see it anywhere but in Hume. People are always described one way or another. And Hume really gets it right because he pays attention to our creatureliness. Okay, what about the objective facts? We are in conditions of what we've come to call Humean scarcity or moderate scarcity, and that's the opening, that marvelous opening. Of all the creatures, it would seem that man is the least well matched between his appetites and his abilities. The lion needs to eat meat, but he's got the mechanisms by which he can kill that gazelle. And the herbivores are well matched with the grasslands before them. But we have appetites that are not obviously and naturally satisfied by the natural environment we're in. Neither is our environment a nightmare in which social cooperation would be pointless. We are not in some kind of post-apocalyptic horror, not yet, in which there'd be no point in cooperating because it's just a hopelessly messed up situation. We are in moderate scarcity where there isn't so much give. We're not in Eden. We're not in some Garden of Eden where, without making any effort or making any social coordination, we could possibly want is simply there. If we lived in the Garden of Eden, we wouldn't need social theory either. On the other hand, we're not in some, hopeless post-apocalyptic nightmare in which there'd be very little point in cooperating either because there's nothing there to extract. No, we're in moderate scarcity. It's a great point. There's just out there that there is a point to cooperation, that there is a point to coordination. We will make ourselves significantly better off if we cooperate and coordinate. And then Hume, as if this weren't enough, ladies and gentlemen, makes another point. It's not enough that this be true. It has to be the case that people know it's true. It's not enough that cooperation makes us better off. We have to know it and work for it. How do we find this out? Well, again, some of it we find out through family life. In family life, we are the recipient of a certain amount of care and solicitation, worry about our welfare. Reciprocity arises in this kind of context. As we get older, we do things for those who've helped us out. We begin to cooperate on certain projects and do better than we otherwise would have. Parents and children will tend to their cattle together or look for, objects to hunt together and do better as a result. Hume says this, and I think it's a great insight. We need not make an explicit acknowledgement of this fact to come to be sensible of it. He gives this example because, again, with Hume, natural habit always does so much of the explanatory work. He gives this example of two people in a rowboat, and they will begin to row in time. No one needs say, now at the count of three, you row. At the count of three, you row. No, if we just start rowing, we will start rowing in time. We will start rowing in a coordinated way. We will find ourselves able, here's the point behind this, to develop good, coordinated, intentional, goal-directed activity without the explicit articulation of the principles of such. When these two people are rowing, nobody needs to talk. We might not even have language yet, but we will discover through trial and error and this mutual interest in making ourselves better off than we are without coordination, we will discover the forms of cooperation that make us better off. Marvelous account. So complex social behavior arises in this fundamentally natural way. This is not a social contract theory. Hume thinks this is just a meaningless fiction. We can account for how persons come to have complex social interactions in the story I just gave. Okay, property. What's that doing here? Well, property, Hume thinks, is a very interesting construction that both, how can I put it, feeds our self-interest and checks our self-interest. It's a really interesting discovery that by having this institution of property, we make ourselves better off, and at the same time, we set up a certain limit to what we can otherwise get or take. Okay, there's a very nice small point in the background, which is the following. Hume says there are, I think I'm getting this right, roughly 3 goods. I'm having trouble what the third one is. Well, the main point is, perhaps it's only 2. There are my inner thoughts, my inner pleasures, my pleasant dreams, my pleasure in the sunset, and so forth and so on. And there are, of course, the objects in the world that I employ and enjoy. And it's rather obvious that while you can destroy my inner states, you can torture me and the like, you cannot yourself have them and use them. This is not something you can ever possess. Whereas my stereo works just as well in your apartment as it does in mine. My coat keeps you warm as well as me. Possessions have this very interesting property that they enhance the welfare of whomever happens to have it. And so what property does is this. It is an artificial construction that gives a certain kind of owner a claim on the thing even when they don't have possession. So to say this stereo is my property is to say that even if you take it and bring it to your apartment, the state or the community will take it back. Compare this to, say, a basketball in a basketball game. There, it's entirely possession. If you have the ball, if you're holding it, if I take it from you, now it's mine. There's no sense in which the ball is anyone's property, by which I mean it simply follows its possessor. Whereas property remains mine even if you take it, in the sense that I continue to have a claim that we will assume will be enforced, if it can be, even if you manage to get possession. And that, of course, makes all the difference. It's very different. You see this with 2 cheetahs tussling over the hide of the gazelle. Whoever has possession has it. There's no sense in which this is either of their property. But my wallet is my property. And if someone takes it, I really don't have to come after you and try and take it back. There's a whole state apparatus which will do that because it's property, not a mere possession. And Hume's point is that property is this construction. It's an artificial idea, and artificial in the sense that man-made. It's not natural. It arises to do a certain kind of work. It makes our lives more secure. It turns mere possession into something far more stable. Of course, I have some worries when I leave my apartment, but I have a great deal less than if there were no such thing as property. If all I had was possession, and I guess, sadly, this is how it often is for people who are really homeless and they have everything in their shopping carts and they don't have property claims on this, and they do have to worry about theft all the time, and they have very little recourse because they can't easily say to the police that was my property. I don't really know if there's any recognition of property rights in that context, but I think you see the point. It's largely a possession story. And then you really have to worry about maintaining possession. And Hume says, yeah, that's right. And so we construct the idea of property, which is exactly that, which goes beyond mere possession and recognizes a right to the thing independent of possession. Okay, this idea, which limits what you can rightfully take and possess, paradoxically is, as I just said a moment ago, a limit on your natural self-interest and interest for your family. If it's your neighbor's property, you can't plow it. You can't just, take your plow there and plant more corn to get more wealth for you and your family. It's not your property. On the other hand, the institution of property makes it so much more stable for you insofar as you have the property that you do have. And it enables you to accumulate whatever wealth you can with so much more stability and security. So property both limits our ability to take things from the world and at the same time offers us a kind of security and stability in whatever we manage to accumulate for ourselves. So it has, if you will, this fantastic utility. The construction of property, Hume compares it to language or money. And indeed, his account of property is very close to what almost everybody thinks of as money. Money arises, even Locke with his naturalistic account of property has this constructivist account of money. Yeah, people just realized, this is a worthy digression perhaps, that it's fine to just take something, some metal, and make that a substitute for the thing. That way you can move beyond mere barter. If you don't have money, you're stuck with mere barter. Maybe you want my, beaver skins and I want your corn, but at a certain point, there's only so much corn I can eat and only so many beaver skins you can wear. Mere barter really limits the degree to which exchanges can go forward. Whereas when there's money, there's no limit to how much I might be able to sell and what I can save, and so how much I should produce. So money is a construction with this very, very clear utility. And Hume is suggesting this, but even on a deeper level, since it's tied to our limited generosity, our interest in our own families on one hand, our lack of altruism towards strangers on the other, and at the same time, our need to turn possessions into something more stable. And that's what property does. Pretty, if I weren't on camera, I'd use a different word. Pretty amazing argument. Pretty terrific argument. I think it's just one of the best in all of social and political philosophy. But there's more. However, Hume says, here I am giving this utilitarian defense of the institution of property, but how can it really be the case that the rules of property, what Hume often calls here the rules of justice, he just means, enforcing the rules of property. How can it be the case that I can say these promote more utility when, and this is Hume's own example, sometimes enforcing a will mean that this wealth goes to what Hume calls a wastrel and a bigot, when there are so many other more needy people, say, starving in the heath on the highlands. This would not have been some made-up idea for you. He's writing in late 18th century Scotland when a great deal of poverty in the Scottish Highlands coexisted with all kinds of outrageous property holdings. And Hume asks, so how can enforcing an inheritance be said to promote utility when you can think of a case where you're giving that, 100,000 pounds to, Lord Braggart down in London, whereas there are all these Scottish widows and children here in the Highlands who could use that 100,000 pounds so much more. How can it be the case that respect for the rules of property does promote utility? We're back in this sort of, criticism of the utilitarian rule. And Hume's answer is the practice of being able to give the property to whomever you wish is crucial to it being yours to begin with. If your property were subject to the state's assessment as to who needs it more upon your death, then it's not your property to begin with. And then the utility collapses. Your incentive to accumulate this wealth, to save, disappears because it's not really yours. You can give it to your children only if the state can't find a more needy recipient. And if property were subject to that assessment, it wouldn't be property at all. be something else. You might call it schmoperty. You keep it until, you die, and then the state decides who will have this wealth. And Hume's point is, yeah, we could have chosen schmoperty rather than property, but it's property that has the greater utility. As this line, the scheme must be judged as a whole. It's not the particular bequest at a particular time that is said to have utility. It's the understanding that it's mine to give to whom I wish to that has the utility. That's where the utility lies. It's in the fundamental understanding that operates for persons that has the utility it has. And so we accept that in particular cases, we don't seem to be transferring wealth to those who need it most. But it's precisely in the bequest's indifference to that assessment that it is truly my property. And unless it were understood along those lines, there'd be no utility at all. So that's his utilitarian defense. I should say, for the progressives out there, Hume never considers how this defense, what it is for it to be my property, would be compatible with some amount of redistribution. And this is a very interesting question, one that, liberals struggle with all the time, like myself. You want to say, well, sure, it has to be understood as mine, but that's compatible with, say, an inheritance tax of 20%. Yeah, it doesn't mean that there couldn't be any redistribution to the poor consistent with some notion of ownership. Hume never considers that. But I think he is right to say whatever, or offer an argument which could be modified along the lines I'm modifying it. And that would be whatever redistribution there would be upon death, it has to be small enough that it's consistent with the idea of fundamental ownership throughout the period of property accumulation. Otherwise, you do have the problem that certain aggressively collectivist economies have had: insufficient incentive for the production of greater wealth. And there, you might say, well, there is no property really, or substantial property in, say, the Soviet Union, and you lose the utility as a result. Maybe so, but you could have some redistribution, as we do in this country, consistent with very robust recognition of Hume's point that there must be sufficient discretionary control over the accumulation for it to be my property to begin with. That point must be acknowledged. There's no utility without the institution. The institution must be, in a way, indifferent to what the best possible distribution upon death might be, but it need not be hostile to any and all forms of redistribution, as I think my example shows. And I just think Hume didn't think of it. This is just one of those cases where, experience proves it. You can have a lot of wealth accumulation and a lot of individual, incentivization consistent with all kinds of redistribution policies. People still study to get into medical school in Sweden. People still make Volvos and sell, make IKEA and H&M, even though they have pretty aggressive redistribution arrangements upon death and the like. We'll take this up again later in the course. My point is only the very modest one. Hume is certainly right that there has to be indifference to the totalistic story, the idea that all this could be redistributed if the state could find a better recipient. That would be incompatible with property. It doesn't follow that no tax or no redistribution is consistent with ownership. What Hume does show is, unless there's sufficient sense of it being mine to bequest as I like, in a way that's utility indifferent, it's not property. And then you don't have the utility at all. Unless the bequest can be respected, even if it's utility indifferent, you don't have the utility of property. That's the genius of Hume's argument. And I'll repeat it. The bequest has to be respected in a way that is utility indifferent. If I leave this to my nephew who's a jerk, that's kind of my deal. That's what it is for it to be my property. If it's mine to give, it's given in ways that are indifferent to where the greater utility would be. The state can't come in and say, oh, I have a much more worthy recipient. Well, then it was really not my property to begin with. And then you don't get the utility of property at all. All right, plenty to chew on. Please check it out. And I'm not exactly sure when our next Zoom class is. I'm hoping it can still be Thursday at 1, but we seem to be in a bit of limbo on that. Please be in touch with me. Let me know your preferences, and we'll be in touch. Thank you very much.